Good morning, Martin. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for watching us here at Abralim ao Vivo, Linguists Online. This meeting is organized by the Brazilian Linguistics Association in cooperation with Permanent International Linguistics Committee, Latin America Linguistics and Philology Association, Argentine Society of Linguistic Studies, and Linguistic Society of America. Today, we have the honor to receive Professor Martin Hilpert, who very kindly accepted our invitation to be here with us. Thank you, Martin. I am Angélica Furtado from Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Norte e Universidade Federal da Paraíba. Abralim has invited me to introduce Professor Hilpert, and I am delighted to welcome him. Martin Hilpert is a professor of English linguistics at University of Neuchâtel, where he is the head of the Institute of English Language and Literature. His research focuses on three main issues: usage-based linguistics, specifically the framework of construction grammar, the development of new corpus-based methodologies, and the combination of experimental psycholinguistic approaches with corpus-based approaches. He is also one of the main editors of the journal Functions of Language and an associate editor for the journal Cognitive Linguistics. The title of today's talk is Diachronic, Corpora, Culture, and Constructional Change. After the talk, Professor Hilpert agreed to answer a few questions from the audience. I would also like to thank TraduPoints for the simultaneous translations from English. Okay, let's get started. Martin, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm going to share my slides now so that you can see them. Okay, Angélica, can you tell me if you can see everything?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this wonderful series. It's really, really fantastic. I've been following many of the lectures, and it's such a wonderful initiative, and it's a great honor to be with you all today, even in this digital format. I would love to be with you in Brazil in person, but this is fantastic no matter what. Yeah. So in my talk today, I would like to discuss diachronic, corpora, culture, and constructional change, and how these three ideas relate to one another. And to get us started, let me say a few words about corpus methodology, and more specifically, the analysis of diachronic corpus data. So most of my personal work has been based on corpus data from different historical periods. And as a historical corpus linguist, I have been living in interesting times. A lot has changed just over the course of the last couple of years. A lot of new corpora have become available, and with them, new analytic methods and new research questions. And you actually don't have to take my word for that. Other researchers are just as excited as I am. On this slide, you see a picture of Jean-Baptiste Michel giving a TED talk about all the things that can be done with the Google ngram corpus, which is a very large data resource. So there's a lot that can be done with that data. And in the 2010 paper where he and others first presented that resource, he states that large diachronic corpora can provide insights about fields as diverse as lexicography, the evolution of grammar, collective memory, the adoption of technology, the pursuit of fame, censorship, and historical epidemiology. So this has even a very current relevance to our lives. So what this means is that we currently have diachronic linguistic data that holds the promise of revealing to us pretty much everything we have ever wanted to know about change, be it cultural or social change, technological change, political change, or even linguistic and grammatical change. It's right there. We only have to stretch out our hand and bring the evidence to light. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, lots of researchers have attempted to look at diachronic corpus data and to draw conclusions from their observations. And an example that I'd like to mention here is work by Patricia Greenfield, who is a psychologist with expertise in the development of cultures. Her work on social change in North America links fundamental social trends such as urbanization and economization to a theoretical model that distinguishes two notions, and she has German words for those notions, namely Gesellschaft on the one hand and Gemeinschaft on the other. Gesellschaft, that roughly translates into society, and Gemeinschaft, well, that is more community. And I'm oversimplifying her model here, of course, but essentially the trend that she sees historically is away from Gemeinschaft, so away from community-related values, towards Gesellschaft-related values, so towards values that are individualistic and competitive. In Greenfield's words, she applies this to the United States, and she says, as the United States moved ever further in the Gesellschaft direction, Gesellschaft-adapted cultural features showed a quantitative increase, whereas Gemeinschaft-adapted cultural features showed a quantitative decrease. So what Greenfield does empirically in her study is an analysis of Google Ngram data. You see some graphs on this slide here. So she looks at frequency trends over time, and she looks at lexical elements such as obliged and choose in the first panel here, or give and get in the lower panel on the left-hand side, or individual, and that's the blue line that you see here, or obedience that you see here. And she notices systematic differences. So Gemeinschaft, community-related lexis, shows frequency decreases, and Gesellschaft-related lexis is on the rise, it's increasing. So in a sense, what she's doing is that she's checking if the linguistic data are in fact in line with other observations that she is making that are non-linguistic phenomena. Yeah. So on the basis of the Google Ngram data, she concludes that yes, the linguistic data and the social data, they actually seem to be in line. They seem to corroborate one another. And she concludes from this that these findings signify that books as cultural products, so that is the Google Ngram corpus that she's talking about, they reflect human ecology. They also signify that cultural features can be indexed by word use frequencies, which in turn reflect what is prioritized by a population. Now, this kind of statement would be received with some skepticism by corpus linguists. So we have been trained in a way to be wary of the idea that word use frequencies are to be taken at face value for any underlying changes that happen. Yeah, so there are so many interfering factors there. The way the corpus is composed, what texts you are sampling, what variety you're looking at, what the genre conventions are. So this looks like a little bit of a shortcut. And so one might think that, well, this is perhaps the kind of statement that we would hear from a psychologist or from an economist or from physicists even. So other disciplines have been very interested in linguistic data as well, and they have been drawing their conclusions. But surely no linguist would ever make a claim like that. Well, it turns out that there's a linguist on record, actually, with regard to this issue. And you had him on the channel just a few days ago. So rather famously, Chomsky argued against the use of corpus frequencies because in his view, these corpus frequencies reflect culture rather than language. So I'm talking, of course, about the famous I live in New York, I live in Dayton, Ohio examples. So if you look at a large corpus of American English, you will find many, many tokens of New York, or even I live in New York, and comparatively fewer tokens of Dayton, Ohio, or I live in Dayton, Ohio. And the reasons are, of course, exactly those that Greenfield invokes for her data. Word use frequencies reflect what is prioritized by a population. So in a nutshell, we can be skeptical about Greenfield's use of linguistic data, but it's also not clear how clear-cut this position really should be. So in fact, Mark Liberman, he has a post on the language log where he expresses a more nuanced position that I think many of us can actually get behind. So what Mark says is this: I'm not arguing that her theory is wrong, or that the Google Ngram datasets don't contain supporting evidence. But it's going to take a much more careful and systematic analysis of the lexico-historical data to convince me. In other words, we must have a clear idea of how diachronic data should be analyzed in order to tell us something reliable about social change and about cultural change. And this, if you like, is the overarching question that I have for this talk. How can diachronic corpus data give us reliable insights about social change? Right, let me start by giving you an overview for the coming minutes. I think I'll need about 40 minutes or so of your time. I'll start by summarizing 3 problems that any analysis of social change in diachronic corpus data has to address. And as a way of memorizing and then keeping track of them, I've decided to name these problems after the researchers who made me aware of them. So we'll be dealing with what I call Fillmore's screwdriver. We will attend Flass' grammar lesson. And after that, we'll take a look at the rising sea levels of Köpenick and Müller-Spitzer. Right, so once I've made you aware of these problems and the dangers that they're associated with, I will actually try my hand at approaching culture and constructional change with corpus data, and we'll see where that leads us. Okay, right. So the phenomenon that I have selected for this purpose is one that you may be familiar with. It's an English causative construction that is called the make causative. And the choice of this construction is motivated by the fact that it actually relates to something that Greenfield is talking about in her work, namely the fading of interpersonal authority and its social consequences. So this will allow me to get back to some of her graphs and her points. Right, I'll also make a brief detour to Dutch. So there's a case from Dutch that is relevant for the English data. We'll look at that. I will investigate data from 2 corpora of American English, the corpus of contemporary American English and the corpus of historical American English, and we'll see what developments can be seen in that data. And then eventually I'll get to my conclusions. Okay, so I hope you can hear me well. If anything is going on, I hope that Michel or Angelica will give me a sign of some sort. But let's start with Fillmore's screwdriver. So I've had the big privilege of spending a year with Chuck and his FrameNet project. And during one meeting with FrameNet researchers, he made an observation that stayed with me. So somehow the issue of corpus frequencies and New York and Dayton, Ohio came up. And Chuck said, well, not so fast. Yeah? Corpus frequencies and real world frequencies, sometimes they line up, but sometimes they don't. Yeah, and he had an example, as he always did. So if you take a large corpus and you search for the phrase with a screwdriver, and you look at the collocates of that phrase, and more specifically, the verbal collocates of that phrase. So verbs that occur to the left and right of the phrase with a screwdriver, you get results that are curious. Yeah? So here are the most frequent verbs that occur to the left and right of this phrase. And they would seem to suggest that screwdrivers are very, very dangerous. Okay, so we have among the top collocates, armed, stabbed, threatened, and attacked. And these are just raw frequencies. Right? We haven't applied any collocational statistic yet. So it really seems that perhaps screwdrivers are a bit too dangerous and we shouldn't be selling them in hardware stores. Now, as we all know, screwdrivers are perfectly safe, yeah? And most of the time they are perfectly harmless. But the corpus results seem to be in contrast and conflict with that. So this gives us something to think about. When exactly do we expect corpus frequencies and real world frequencies to line up? Yeah? And when do we expect there to be some discrepancy? And for that, it may be useful to make a distinction between two different types of frequency. So on the one hand, we have what could be called semasiological frequency, which is text frequency as we usually conceive of it, and which expresses how often a speaker verbalizes or writes down a given concept. So this obviously we can measure easily with Corpora, but then there's another type of frequency, which here I call onomasiological frequency, which expresses how often speakers experience or encounter a given concept. So at least for me personally, fixing a screw, that's something that has reasonably high onomasiological frequency. So it's quite often that I'm around the house fixing little things. And so this happens quite often, but since it is such a mundane event, its semasiological frequency is low. I don't very often tell people about myself fixing a screw here and there in the house. Okay, so this in a nutshell is a Fillmore screwdriver. When do real world frequencies and corpus frequency line up, and when do they not? And with that, I'd like to move on to Flass's grammar lesson. This is Susanne Flach, who you see here. She's working with me. And she has pointed out that frequency trends, such as the one that we see here with give and with get, have to be taken with a grain of salt, because verbs such as give and get are highly polysemous. So they participate in many different grammatical patterns. I illustrate this for the verb get on this slide. So get, of course, occurs in its lexical meaning of receiving something. I get more money now. But there are also other constructions like they get things done. So get as a kind of light verb or auxiliary verb. Get can function as a copula. I'm getting ready. It participates in the English get passive construction. She got hit. There are particle verbs like get up. There is ditransitive get. She got him a present, which interestingly means the exact opposite of receiving. Yeah? It's giving something rather than getting something. And of course, there are idiomatic expressions like I just don't get it, with the meaning I don't understand it. Right. So right. The point that Susanne is making is that there's a danger in equating the aggregate frequency developments. So the one line with get here with developments of the concepts that are targeted, such as receiving for get. Yeah? So does this line really have anything to do with receiving? And when we look at the frequencies of all the participating constructions, it would seem that not really. So on this slide, you see the red line here, which captures how often we have get in its lexical sense of receiving something. So get plus a nominal object. And it's actually all the other ones that are responsible for the overall increase of get. Right. So the essence of Flass' grammar lesson is in line with Mark Liberman's call for an analysis that is careful and systematic. We want to be very precise about the patterns that we analyze, and we want to minimize confounds. And Flass' grammar lesson also shows us that lexis is potentially treacherous. So lexical items can change their meanings, new items may replace old ones, and there's obviously the problem of which lexical items to include in an analysis in the first place. So in the light of this, there's probably a case to be made against relying too much on lexical material. And perhaps we should rather try to see if there are grammatical constructions that can be used for the purpose of studying social and cultural change. Now, you may ask, okay, why exactly should we be using grammatical items? Well, the reason for that is that grammatical elements are relatively more obligatory in language. Yeah? Lexical elements, we can avoid them, we can choose something else, we can find an alternative, but grammatical items are not as easily avoided. And sometimes a speaker cannot avoid them at all. So Roman Jakobson famously pointed out that languages don't really differ a lot in what they can express, but rather they differ significantly in what they must express. Yeah, as an example, my native language is German, and German has these gendered articles, der, die, das. So if I'm using a noun, I have to choose, yeah, and I have to pick the right one, and it's my grammar that forces me to do that. Right. So there are grammatical constructions, and I'll come back to this in a few minutes, that may be both more useful and more reliable as indicators of social change than lexical elements. Right, so that's Flass' grammar lesson. Be careful about the elements that you're using and be aware of the different meanings that they have. Now, the rising sea levels. So this is a picture of Caroline Müller-Spitzer. Alexander Koplenik is her co-author. And they have written a very interesting paper where they start by pointing out an intriguing correlation, namely, languages seem to be more lexically diverse, so they have more words in their vocabulary, if they have more speakers. This is what you see in these graphs here for a range of languages. So on the y-axis, we have type token ratio as a measure of how lexically diverse a language is. And on the x-axis, we have population size. And there are diagonals of different angles. Yeah, so Chinese is a bit unusual here, but the others seem to have upward slopes, indicating that the more speakers you have, the greater your vocabulary. And from a linguistic point of view, well, that seems plausible. Yeah, the more speakers we have, perhaps the more variety there is, the more dialects, there's diversification, more elements, and so on and so forth. So yeah, why not? However, there is a worrying complication, which I show you here in the second graph. So it appears that lexical diversity, which we still have on the y-axis, also correlates with another variable, namely global means in sea level. So in other words, higher tides mean greater lexical diversity. And this, of course, is a nonsensical or spurious correlation. And it may lead you to suspect that also the first correlation is actually not as watertight as it may look at first sight. So there could be a confounding variable that is actually responsible for both. And well, if you look at this for a couple of minutes, you may actually find the answer yourselves. The confounding intervening variable is, of course, time. So for most of the languages that you see here, type token ratio has increased with the passage of time. And simultaneously, population sizes have gone up and sea levels have risen as well. So all of these three variables change at the same time, and they just correlate spuriously. Now, This is in fact the major point that Koplínek and Müller-Spitzer are making. When two phenomena exhibit temporal trends, then it's actually dangerous to correlate them without controlling for the effect of time itself. And this I'm going to illustrate with the graphs that you see here. So here we see two phenomena, artificial phenomena, that show clear temporal trends, upward developments. As time passes, the values go up. And the point that Koplínek and Müller-Spitzer make is, if you correlate the values of the two trends, you will definitely obtain a significant value. But it will not tell you whether the two phenomena are in fact related, if one is contingent on the other. So in order to find out whether there is a relation, it's not only the overall trends that we need to look at, but also the individual changes from one point to the next. And if you look at these graphs, you see that sometimes the curve actually goes down and then it goes back up a little bit and then it goes down a little bit and so on and so forth. So if we overlay these two graphs, are the ups and downs matching or are they not? So this is diagrammed in these graphs below here. I'm going to explain to you what you see. The lower graphs show the changes from one point in time to the next. So if we have a point here that is above the 0 line, that means that the first step here is upward. Let me show you this. Okay, so here we have an upward change and the point here is above the 0 line. Now for phenomenon B, the first step is actually downward. So this point is a little bit below the 0 line. If we go to the second step, both phenomenon A and phenomenon B go down just a little bit. So both points are just below the 0 line. After that, both go up quite considerably. Then A goes up a little bit, B goes down, and so on and so forth. And Koplínek and Müller-Spitzer argue that two phenomena are related if and only if their ups and downs correspond across the entire trend. Now, when A goes up a little, then B should go up a little, and when A goes up a lot, then B should also go up a lot. And as you see in this graph, there's really no such correspondence in the data here. So many high values of phenomenon A correspond to low values of phenomenon B. That's what would be in this quadrant, and vice versa. So here we have high changes in phenomenon A, but low changes in phenomenon B. Okay, so in a nutshell, Koplínek and Müller-Spitzer's idea of accepting correlations only if changes correlate, that acts as a filter against correlations that are potentially spurious. So it filters away much of what could be interpreted as somehow related in history and in culture and so on and so forth. So this is a very healthy safeguard, I find. So I think this is a very useful idea. Right, let me summarize very quickly the three problems. So Fillmore's screwdriver tells us that cultural features cannot be indexed by word use frequencies, at least not all of the time. So it works with New York and Dayton, Ohio. It does not work with a screwdriver. Then we have Flass' grammar lesson, which tells us that word use frequencies have to be controlled for grammatical constructions. And we have the rising sea levels of Koplínek and Müller-Spitzer, which tell us that correlations in time series data can be spurious if they're not controlled by correlating changes rather than absolute values. Right, so those are the cons in a way that make it difficult to study culture on the basis of diachronic corpus data. But is there anything that we can do? So for the rest of this talk, I'm trying to be more positive and trying to see if there's something that we can work out. And for that, there's a construction that I want you to, that I want to talk about a little bit, namely the English make causative. And let me start by giving you a few examples of this. So there's one example that I guess everyone here is familiar with. You make a grown man cry. I'll say the words that make you blush is another one. You make the rockin' world go round, and it made my eyes be getting blurry. Why did I pick these? Well, as I got interested in the construction, it struck me that it seems to be very popular in rock music and pop music. And so if you listen out for the construction, I'm sure you'll hear it just about everywhere. So that's why you see these pictures here. But then again, of course, I'm showing you these because the construction exhibits some interesting semantic variation, which I think can be viewed against the context of social and cultural change. So one important variable that I want to look at is animacy, both with regard to the causer and the causee. So we have animate causers in "you make a grown man cry" or "you make the rockin' world go round." So the person who's responsible for the causation event is alive, as a human being. And then we have examples like, I'll say, "the words that make you blush," or "it made my eyes be getting blurry," where we have an entity that is not animate, that is not a human being, that is behind the causation event. So the causer can be animate or inanimate, and likewise the causee, the person or the entity that is affected and that is doing an activity as a consequence of being caused, can be animate or inanimate. So with "you make a grown man cry," we have the configuration that both causer and the causee are animate. With, I'll say, "the words that make you blush," we have an inanimate causer and an animate causee. And down here, we have inanimate causees in "you make the rockin' world go round" and "it made my eyes be getting blurry." Now, of course, decisions here are sometimes, well, difficult to make. So eyes are not persons, but they belong to an animate human being. So how should we be coding them? I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. Okay, so there's a lot that has been said about this construction. My dissertation supervisor, Suzanne Kemmer, has studied the make causative, and she has identified 3 semantic frames that are associated with the make causative. And she calls these first the mechanical action frame, in examples such as "the sun made the ice melt." So there we have, the sun causing the ice to melt without any authority or intention or anything of that sort going on. In the second frame, the experiential response frame, we have examples like "it made her feel good," where the causee is animate and has an emotional or experiential response. And then down here, we have the compulsion frame, exemplified by sentences like "don't make me marry him." And there we have this component of authority and obedience and so on and so forth. So this third frame really caught my attention because it requires a pairing of animate causer and animate causee, and it relates to this issue of authority and social change. So let's take a look at Greenfield's frequency developments. 2 nouns that she sees in decline are obedience, so that is the blue line that you see here that's going down, and authority, which is the red one, so also that curve is going down. And the compulsion frame of the English make causative is really the closest thing that we have to a grammaticalized marker of authority and obedience in the English language. So that made it worth my while to look into this construction a little bit more. Now, I think we can all agree that, thankfully, English-speaking cultures have become less authoritative and less focused on obedience over the past couple of 100 years. So English-speaking cultures have become less authoritative. If we look at the workplace, if we look at schools, universities, the family, I would say that the onomasiological frequency of coerced action has gone down historically. And it stands to reason. Shouldn't this social development be reflected some way, in the way that speakers of English use the make causative and in its semasiological frequency. And there actually is a parallel case from Dutch, which provides us with some food for thought, which I want to talk about very briefly here. So this is Arie Verhagen, and he has compared two Dutch constructions with two causative verbs, namely the verb doen, which translates do, yeah, and Latin, which means let. So the respective structures are very similar to what we have in English. Here's an example of the Latin causative, translates as the sergeant made us crawl through the mud, literally let us crawl through the mud. And then there is the causative with doen, the bright sun makes the temperature rise, and literally it's does the temperature rise. Now, Verhagen retrieves examples of these constructions from historical corpora of Dutch, and he finds that for doen, animate causers are on the decline. So you see this in the first row here, it goes down from 57% to 47% to 20% in the 20th century. And Verhagen explains this in the following way. Let me read this to you. Now, of the factors mentioned above, he considers several factors that could be responsible for this development. The most plausible one to have changed much over the last 3 centuries is that of authority. We already know from all kinds of sources that 200 years ago, authority was a much more important determinant of social and personal relationships, or at least of their evaluation, than it is today. Okay, so now we can actually put Greenfield and Verhagen together and formulate a hypothesis and some empirical predictions for English. So our hypothesis would be that fading authority has left its mark on the way the English make causative construction has been used over the past 150 years. And breaking this down into more specific predictions, there are 3 predictions that I want to make. First of all, uses of the make causative with the meaning of compulsion, the third semantic frame, they should decrease. The second prediction is that uses of the make causative with animate causers, they should be decreasing as well, because, well, those uses would lend themselves to, well, causers that exert authority and demand obedience and so on and so forth. And then the third prediction would be that uses of the make causative in which both causer and causee are animate, and hence open to the idea of compulsion, they should decrease as well. Right, so let's see if there's anything to this. For the analysis, I retrieved examples of the make causative construction from the corpus of historical American English, searching for a form of the verb make, then a noun phrase with up to 3 words, so that would be the causee, and then a verb in the infinitive. And after manual cleanup, I was left with some 38,000 examples, which I then annotated for 3 variables. First of all, the verb type. So is it make you cry, or make me get, or make me understand, something like that. And then animacy in the causer and animacy in the causee. So causer and causee, well, for both, I adopted a simple distinction between animate and inanimate, dodging some potentially problematic decisions like what to do with human collectives and what to do with body parts and other things where we might not be too sure as to how to code them with regard to animacy. I'll be happy to explain what I did in detail. Right, so let's take a closer look at what the data actually reveals. First result is that the make causative actually undergoes a moderate frequency increase over the past 150 years. So this is in partial contrast to the Dutch doen causative, which decreases in text frequency. A second observation that we can make is that animate causers, that is the red line that you see here, yeah, that seems to be more or less stable. Yeah? There are some ups and downs, but on the whole, 1860 doesn't look too different from 2000. So if we compare that to the blue line here, inanimate causers are relatively on the rise, especially during the second half of the 20th century. So this means that our second prediction is true in relative terms. So the relative frequency of animate causers, well, its share gets smaller as opposed to the inanimate causers. Now, when we look at the causes, it appears that both animate and inanimate causes are on the rise. So both of these curves go up just a little bit over the past 150 years. Okay, now what's still missing from the picture, and what is of course crucial, is the development of the 4 different animacy configurations of causer and causee. And this is what we see here. So these 4 lines in a way correspond to the pictures with Mick Jagger and Ed Sheeran and Freddie Mercury that you saw earlier. So the blue line would be the combination of an inanimate causer and an animate causee. So this would be Ed Sheeran, the words that make you blush. Animate causer, animate causee, that's Mick Jagger, you make a grown man cry, and that stays relatively stable. Yeah, and the remaining ones are relatively infrequent, and they develop in almost the same way. Yeah, so animate causer and inanimate causee, that goes up a little bit, and inanimate causer and inanimate causee, it made my eyes be getting blurry, that is also increasing just a tiny bit. Okay, so what's interesting here, I think, is that the only configuration that doesn't show an increase is the yellow one with an animate causer and an animate causee. So all animate uses of the make causative, they include those uses that express relations of authority and obedience. And apparently that configuration is on the decline. So far, this looks like there might be something that is happening with regard to the make causative and authority. But of course, well, we should remain skeptic, because this all animate configuration can also appear in the experiential response frame. So in you make a grown man cry, well, we can argue if that has anything to do with authority or obedience. But there are certain situations where it doesn't have anything to do with obedience, at least not in the way that a sentence like "don't make me marry him" would imply. Okay, so in order to address our first prediction, in order to find out what's really going on semantically with the make causative, we need to take a closer look at the verbs that are used in the construction. And for that, I decided to take a distributional approach that I will have to explain in a few words. So this will take 5 minutes or so, but then we'll get back to the make causative. On this slide, we have different verbs that appear in the make causative construction: cry, catch, smile, cheer, understand. And they are semantically of different types. They belong to different categories, if you like. And if you were to give these verbs to a human observer, they would probably tell you that, well, you can distinguish these along the lines of, well, emotional verbs, cry and laugh. Then there are mental verbs such as understand and believe. And there are caused motion verbs like catch and roll and lift and so on and so forth. Right. Now, distributional semantics is a computational way of studying semantic similarity across different lexical elements like these here. And what you see in this graph is something very similar to what we saw just here, where we have a human categorization of lexical elements. So here, a computer was taught to categorize the make causative verbs in a way that is quite similar to what a human being would have done. So that is the method that I'm going to be using, and I'd like you to show, I'd like you to see a few things that are necessary to get this method to work. So how does this automatic positioning in semantic space work? What work steps are involved? A first work step is that we have to take a set of verbs, a lexicon, so to speak, and we have to retrieve frequencies of context items from a corpus. So essentially, let's say that we're interested in this vocabulary of verbs. So we would make a collection of these verbs, and the German word for vocabulary is actually Wortschatz, which is why I put the treasure chest here. Yeah, but it's a convenient symbol anyway. So we take our Wortschatz and we take a corpus, and for every element in the vocabulary, we can generate concordance lines so that we look up the verb cry in the corpus, and then we get a display of the keyword and the context to the left and right of the keyword. Now, once we have that, we can eliminate words that are not specifically informative of the keyword. So these would be stop words like prepositions or pronouns or articles or grammatical verbs like to be or have or things like that. So these stop words would be eliminated, and only interesting, contentful words remain in the context. And these we would then collect in a so-called bag of words, which then represents the context of the lexical element that we're interested in, right? So this would be the context of cry. It's called a bag of words because there's no longer any structure. It's really just a mixture of words that we have collected from the concordance lines. But we can now use this context and transform it into a frequency list so that we see the elements that appear most often in the context of cry. Yeah? And it happens that, for example, the word out or began and started and starts and so on and so forth, they appear quite often with cry. Right, so this we can do, of course, not only for cry, but also for other verbs in our vocabulary, so that we have for each element in the vocabulary a long list of context elements and frequencies for those context elements that provides the basic information that the computer works with to arrive at a measure of semantic similarity. Yeah, so cry and laugh, we know that they are semantically related, and this should show in similarities in the frequency lists. Right, so this is the first work step that we've accomplished. We have taken a set of verbs and we have retrieved frequencies of their context items from a corpus. The second work step now would be to construct a table of frequencies with the verbs in the columns and the context items in the rows. So we construct a table, we take the elements from our vocabulary, we take all the context items, and we fill in the table with all the co-occurrence frequencies that we have extracted from the corpora. Yeah. Okay. So you notice in this table that some cells are 0. So that would mean that, for example, throw, it appears a lot with the item out, but it doesn't co-occur with began in our corpus, at least. Yeah. So yeah, this is something that we'll have to talk about in just a minute. But what we can do now with this kind of arrangement of data is that we can conduct pairwise comparisons of, for example, cry and laugh, where we look at these frequencies and how similar or how different they are. Yeah. So basically what the computer does is make an assessment of how similar or how different these vectors of frequencies really are. And that gives us a result that will hopefully tell us that cry and laugh are semantically quite closely related, while cry and throw might show more important differences. Okay, so that would be the second word step. And so far, our table contains just raw co-occurrence frequencies of vocabulary items and context items. And this is already useful information, but there's something that we still need to do with that information. Namely, we need to apply a collocation measure to abstract away from the raw frequencies. Why is that necessary? It's necessary because of a problem that arises in the context of low frequency elements. So here, for example, you see that smile and throw don't occur with the verb started. So they have a 0 here. Now, if we make an assessment of how different the frequency values are for smile and throw, this would suggest that the two are identical. Yeah? And of course they are. They don't occur with that particular context item. But we don't want the computer to conclude that these are actually semantically similar. So low frequency items have to be accounted for in such a way that we don't interpret zeros as mutual similarity. And that is why we need to apply a collocation measure such as pointwise mutual information. So what this kind of measure allows you to do is to look at a number such as 49 times started to cry. Yeah. Is that more often than we would expect? Is that less often than we would expect? Well, we can calculate that with the help of what corpus linguists call the marginal frequencies of the collocation and its individual elements. So cry on the whole appears some 1,800 times, started on its own appears some 2,400 times, and this large number here represents all of the vocabulary context item combinations that we have retrieved from the corpus. So what we're looking at right now is just the ratio that we see in this row here, which is about 1 to 50, and the ratio of these two numbers here, which is about 1 to 3,000. And so the discrepancy between these values here indicates that started and cry occur with each other a lot more often than we would actually expect by chance. Okay, so this is the kind of information that the collocation measure gives you. Something appears more often than we would actually expect, or less often than we would actually expect. Right, so this brings me to the last and fourth step, namely visualization. So with the table that we have created, we can now create diagrams like the ones that you have seen. And there are many methods available that can turn a table with numerical information into some kind of graphical display of similarity and dissimilarity. So laugh and smile are close to one another. Cry and laugh are not too distant, but cry and, well, here's throw, yeah. You see that throw and catch are practically identical. Well, that's good news. So that's reassuring. Anyway, the result that I was using for the study that you're about to hear about is a larger analysis of this kind, where I took data from a subset of the corpus of contemporary American English, and for each verb in the make causative, I came up with concordances with a context window of forwards to the left and forwards to the right. And I extracted the collocate frequencies, and I calculated collocational measure values with the help of pointwise mutual information. And so it's the same thing that you've seen just a minute ago, just a little bit larger. Yeah? So instead of 9 verbs or 12 verbs, I had about 1,680 verbs, so a larger semantic space. And in order to keep things manageable, I excluded context items below a certain frequency threshold. So if something appeared only 5 times or fewer than that, it was excluded. And also elements with a PMI value below a certain threshold was excluded. So this gave me a final table to work with about 1,681 verbs and close to 5,000 context items, just to give you the dimensions of this. Right, but I'm happy to talk about the technical details if there are questions in the Q&A, but I really want to get to the actual results and what they can tell us about cultural change and authority. So the result of all this technical all this technical machinery is a distribution of verb types that can be mapped onto a two-dimensional surface. And each bubble that you see on this chart represents a verb type. So understand or see or seem or something like that. And relative closeness of bubbles indicates that those two elements have similar collocational behaviors, and we assume meanings that are semantically related on some level. You also see that some bubbles are larger than others. So size represents normalized frequency in the make causative during a specific historical period, namely we're in the 1860s right now. And this, of course, changes over time. Some verbs become more frequent, others become less frequent, some even disappear, and so on and so forth. Let me show you a few labels for some of the verbs to give you an impression of what this representation actually captures. So here we see the same graph, just with some verbs marked up. The markup includes those verbs that are among the most frequent in the make causative during the 1860s. I would like to start by dividing the semantic landscape into three broad areas. Let's maybe start up here with the verbs cry and laugh. So cry and laugh, they clearly illustrate the experiential response frame. Yeah? So if I make you cry or I make you laugh, that has nothing to do with my authority. That is just, I bring about some kind of emotional response in you that is completely involuntary. Okay, so between cry and laugh and feel and sound, there are quite a few other verbs that also fall into this semantic category. So they illustrate the experiential response frame. Now, a bit further down, there are verbs such as wash and eat. So if I make you eat your vegetables and I make you wash your hands, then that has more to do with authority. So this is more illustrative of the compulsion frame. And the lower left corner of the graph contains a couple of other verbs that fall into this broad category or can be read as such. Towards the right, we see verbs that are more abstract than that. So we have things like believe and understand, which are about mental states. And down here, we have verbs like seem and appear, which are also about mental states, except the cognizer is not immediately on stage. So if I understand something or I make you understand something, then the cognizer is expressed. When I say this appears not right, then there's a cognizer implicit in what I'm saying, but it's not expressed verbally. Okay, so cognitive, and we could call them epistemic verbs towards the right-hand side of the graph. Okay, now let's take a look at the historical frequency developments of these verbs. So since we have historical data from the COHA, we can actually see which verbs become more or less frequent between the 1860s and today. We can see where in the semantic space new elements emerge or where elements disappear. In other words, how these three regions of the semantic space develop in terms of their types and the frequencies of those verb types. So let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, here we go. So we're moving through time, and what you see is the coming and going of infrequent verb types, which are present in one period of the COHA and then absent in another. And I'm going to play this again just because this goes really fast. So here we are. Yeah. So you see that there are some success stories. For example, if you focus on the verbs look and sound and feel, yeah, those three here. So they become much more frequent over the past 150 years. So this is what they look like in the year 2000. And if I go back to the start, see they're a lot smaller in the 1860s, and then they become more frequent as time goes on. Right. Now, let's just wait until it has finished playing. There we go. Okay, we're back in the 2000s. Now, I want us to look at the same development from a slightly different perspective. So I'm going to show you the same graph with different colors, and the colors are meaningful. So in this version of the graph, the color of the bubbles represents the ratio of animate causers that are found with that verb. So verbs that are shown in red or orange have strong preference for animate causers. You see the scale up here. Yeah? So if something is red, that means that this verb exclusively occurs with animate causers. So in the 1860s, wash and eat have these animate causers. Understand has a good chunk of animate causers. But the further down we go on the scale, so verbs that are blue would only have inanimate causers. So for example, affect and reflect are verbs that exclusively occur with inanimate causers at this point. Okay, green verbs, they are in the middle, so they take both animate causers and inanimate causers. And well, of course, over time, a verb can change from, let's say, completely blue to something further up the scale. So cry in the 1860s just takes inanimate causers, so sad movies that can make you cry, or sad songs or sad stories. But of course, this may not stay the same. So I'm playing the corpus data once more, and we see some changes happening. And what I find interesting is that nearly all of the most frequent verbs, so again, if you look at look, feel, and sound, have a mixed profile. So so this would mean that despite the relative increase of inanimate causers over time, we don't see that more and more verbs would exclude the possibility of being used with animate causers. It's just that they become more indiscriminate over time. Yeah? So this is representing the side of the causers. Let's also look at the causes. So again, this is the same graph, but the colors have a different significance here. Red verbs, such as cry and laugh, they have only animate causes. You have to be a living being to be able to laugh and cry. There are blue verbs such as affect and in the 1860s also sound. And they only have inanimate causes at this point. And well, again, there are a couple of verbs in the middle like look and seem and appear at this point. Let's see how this has changed over time. And I'd like you to focus here on the verbs look and sound. Yeah, look and sound. And it seems that they are largely responsible for the frequency increase of inanimate causes that we saw earlier. So yeah, we still need to look at the all animate configuration of the made causative, and that is the last movie that I'm going to show you here. What are the verbs that appear in all animate make causatives? Yeah, you make a grown man cry, and don't make me marry him, and so on and so forth. And how do they develop over time? So last graph, and in this one, red and orange verbs have a strong preference for the all animate configuration. Blue verbs never pair an animate causer with an animate causee. Now, one of the roles may be animate, but If it's completely blue, then there is no double animate configuration. Right, let's see how this developed over time. Now, again, we see the frequency increases of look, feel, and sound, and how they change with regard to the animacy configurations. We see decreasing ratios of all animate for believe and understand. And this is interesting because these two do not really instantiate the compulsion frame in its narrow sense. So I can try to make you understand something, or I can try to make you believe in my ideas, but crucially, I cannot pressure you into believing my ideas or into understanding. So this means that the decrease in all animate examples that we see is not so much about what's going on in this area of the semantic landscape. It's not so much about compulsion or a putative fading of interpersonal authority that will be responsible for the developments that we see in the make causative. If anything, compulsion was really already marginal in the 19th century data, and it has remained marginal ever since. So there's not too much going on here. The really interesting developments happen further up here and towards the right side of the semantic space. Okay, now what does this all mean for our hypotheses and our predictions? So just to recall, the hypothesis was that fading authority has left its mark on the way the make causative construction has been used over the past 150 years. And there were different predictions associated with that hypothesis. So we have seen that prediction 2 is actually correct. Uses of the make causative with animate causers decrease, at least in relative terms. We also have seen that uses of the make causative in which both causer and causee are animate are on the decrease. However, the data do not encourage the conclusion that the compulsion frame has decreased in frequency over time, because the loss in all animate uses of the make causative mainly concerns verbs that are not really about compulsion, but about experiential responses. Also, and this is where I'm almost ending, if we take Greenfield's frequency development for authority, and if we overlay that with the frequency development of all animate make causatives, then it becomes relatively obvious that those two developments are not the same. So they would not survive a statistical test of the kind that Koplenik and Müller-Spitzer advocate. The ups and downs are not mirrored in these two curves. Rather, they seem to be independent. So whatever the causes are that drive the waning frequencies of the word authority and the frequencies of the all animate configurations in the make causative, my money would be on the assumption that, well, those are actually two different phenomena that don't go back to the same underlying cause. And with that, I'd like to come to some conclusions. So how can diachronic corpus data give us reliable insights about social change? I actually think that there are some insights that we can gather. So if we base our hypotheses on theories for which there's independent non-linguistic evidence, then we're already off to a good start. Now, Greenfield, of course, does this. She bases her entire argument on a non-linguistic theory and tries to support this with linguistic data. Where I part ways with Greenfield is the second point. So I think we have a greater chance of catching evidence for cultural change if we focus on linguistic phenomena that are obligatory and that involve tightly constrained choices that cannot be simply avoided by speakers. And then we need to account for differences in semasiological frequency and onomasiological frequency, lest we get stabbed by Fillmore's screwdriver. And lastly, we perhaps need to respect and honor the suggestions from Koplenic and Müller-Spitzer and apply statistical methods that put in safeguards against spurious significance. So the good news is that we really have unprecedented amounts of new data at our disposal. There are great things that we can do with it. And these are exciting times and we should enjoy them. But, and this is where I'm going to close, I think we should be enjoying them responsibly. So thanks a lot for your attention, and I look forward to discussing your questions with you.
Thank you, Martin, for your great talk. You certainly addressed important issues that we have faced when we work with diachronic corpus, and like such as the treatment of frequency and how to measure it. So now I have some questions. I don't know if we have enough time to answer them all, but I will select some, okay?
Yeah.
I'll begin with the questions that are identified here for me. I know who asked them, but the other ones have no, so we have, the first one is, sorry. Flavia Bezerra asks, if language is less aggressive over the centuries, could we also predict that strategies or constructions related to politeness or face-saving acts intersubjective meaning could have increased?
Okay, that takes us into the area of, well, can we change society if we try to change language consciously? Okay, there are different opinions on that out there. I happen to think that yes, so we should definitely reflect critically on inherent biases in language, inherent injustices, and we should try to address them. And this, I'm sure, will bring about a social change, not only by applying this language, but also in terms of the discussions that this meta-linguistic discourse will engender. Yeah, so I think it can only be beneficial. I don't really share the skeptical attitudes that are sometimes presented, that we are being forced to use certain, well, politically correct types of language. Well, nobody's going to prison for using the wrong pronouns, but a lot of good can be done by responding to people's needs in terms of what pronouns they would like to use. Okay.
Another question is from Luan Amaral. He asks, how do the different meanings of the make construction with animates emerge? Is it from lexical verbal meanings?
So I think right from the very start, there was a very large meaning potential of the construction. And so over time, different aspects of this meaning potential became conventionalized, so that there are certain conventional patterns associated with the make causative construction. So the examples that I used at the very beginning, you make a grown man cry. So make someone cry or make someone smile. These patterns are very much entrenched. And so they are conventionally associated with the construction. And that's why they, well, are more readily available to us than, let's say, other meanings that are theoretically possible, but not as frequent in actual usage.
Okay, another question related to this last one is, what is behind the overall increase in the frequency of make causatives? Decline in the have causative, less grammaticalized constructions like order somebody to do something.
Yeah, yeah. So there is, of course, an entire paradigm of causative constructions, and the make causative is only one part of that. So one thing that I haven't addressed in the study at all is what is happening elsewhere in this paradigm of causative construction. So it's true, the have causative is very much on its way out. It might be precisely because it's no longer, well, a common thing to talk about that we have servants or some subordinate carrying out an action. Rather, we're asking people politely to do something for us, or we tell them that we need them to do something for us. But this is phrased in a very different way. So I'm convinced that elsewhere in the paradigm of English causative constructions, there are interesting insights to be gained with regards to this overall development of interpersonal authority. I just happen to look at the make causative because it's relatively frequent. It's more frequent than the have causative, and has a greater semantic spectrum. So I was intrigued by this construction, and I wanted to see if I would be able to see things that would either resonate with Greenfield's data or with also Ari Verhagen's study. And I was actually mildly surprised to find the things that I found in the study, that authority doesn't seem to matter all that much to the make causative.
Okay, thank you. We have here an interesting question related to the use of discursive context. And the question is, what large diachronic corpora do not reveal about the multidimensional discursive complexity involved in linguistic change? How to control this concept?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. So, of course, as historical linguists, we are often confined to a very specific kind of data that is often written down, that is often decontextualized as we analyze it, and that is representative of a relatively unusual type of language use. So perhaps the golden age of interactional historical linguistics will come as soon as linguists 2 generations from now will be able to analyze all the videos that are produced in our area. So they might be looking at the conversation that we're having right now, and looking at the unusual syntactic structures that we present to each other. So I'm hopeful that we will learn a lot, actually. And by we, I mean linguists in 100 years, in 150 years, or even later than that. So it's perhaps not bad to keep those folks in mind and to imagine what their perspective will be like, because undoubtedly it will be very different from what we're looking at, and what limited means we really have at our disposal. So it's easy to forget that, because so much has changed in linguistics with regard to data. We have
that's true.
We have things at our disposal that are so rich and so awesome, really, that it's easy to forget that they still have lots of limitations, and by standards that will apply in future generations, it will become all too obvious how naive or how limited our perspective must have been.
Yes, I have to make choices all the time.
Yeah. So I'm saying this seriously and honestly. I hope to be proven wrong about most of the things that I say, because I think that is what science is about, and I hope that the insights of our followers will really correct a great deal of the things that we have come up with.
Okay, I think we can have this one last question.
Sure.
It's from Ryan Lai, and it is about the diagram showed, several diagrams showed. Is the choice of the 2 dimensions of the diagram mostly for convenience of visualization, or too sufficient to capture most of the variance?
It is mostly a choice motivated by convenience. So with regard to the variation that is captured in these diagrams, it is certainly not most of the variation. So Yeah, so I'm using these graphs as a heuristic. So I try to see if there is something to be learned from the distribution in the first 2 dimensions, and then I try to use that information. That said, semantics, and in particular verbal semantics, is much too complex to model just in terms of 2 dimensions. I acknowledge that, and so I wouldn't call these graphs a sufficient or satisfying model of verbal semantics. They show aspects, but they don't provide a full-scale model of what these verbs mean, or how they are used, or how they should be seen as relating to one another. So yeah, it's definitely a matter of convenience rather than any, it doesn't aspire to be more elaborate than that.
Okay, so what do you think? Can you go on, or are you too tired?
I can go on, I'm only getting warm.
Okay, I have one more question about something from Márcia Machado, about something Neumayer said. And
Yeah.
he relates that finds of 2 small corpora, empirical falsity, and their insights proximity to introspection-based analysis. How do you see it?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
It's not a question, really. It's something Neumayer said about using the finds of 2 small corpora. He says that it leads to empirical falsity, and their insights is close to introspection-based analysis.
Okay. I don't usually talk about disagreements across the functional and formal divide, but here there's actually one point that I would like to make. So one recurring point that is made by not only Neumayer, but also other colleagues who are who endorse formal theories, they would, well, the point that I'm criticizing is, can corpora, well, do corpora contain negative evidence or not? So it's clear that if we base our studies on corpora that are too small, then there's an issue of data sparsity, and that may lead to conclusions that are faulty. Okay, that I think is a problem that we can consider to be solved, because corpora these days are so large that they actually represent more linguistic data than a human being would experience during their lifetimes. So there's a danger inherent in that few people actually have thought about, I think. But more importantly, the more interesting problem I find is that, well, formal linguists will usually assume that corpus data can show us what is possible, but they cannot show us what is impossible. And this is a claim that I believe to be wrong. Okay, so I think negative evidence can be inferred on the basis of corpus data, provided that these corpora are large enough. So we not only we can not only detect that, let's say, 2 elements appear close to one another, collocate with another at a frequency that is higher than chance. We can also see that 2 elements never appear next to each other, even though statistically they should. Yeah, so that means that on the basis of corpus data, we can actually explain why certain uses are not felicitous or are judged as odd or ungrammatical even by speakers of the language. And this is a point that I really think is underappreciated. So this point of negative evidence, it is central to Adele Goldberg's latest book, Explain Me This. So if anyone's interested in the phenomenon, I would say, okay, go to Goldberg 2019 for a start. But an important second thread on this issue and on the questions associated with this is present in the work of Anatol Stefanovic, who has written about negative evidence. So if you Google Stefanovic negative evidence, then these are important topics. And well, it certainly brings home the point that corpora can do a lot more than what we traditionally assume they would be able to do.
Okay, so going back to the animacy feature,
yes.
A question asks, do you think this tendency related to animacy affects all causatives, such as the cause-motion construction?
Okay, so my question was very specific with regard to the context of authority. So I think the cause-motion construction, well, there I'm not sure that I would even predict any changes, because quite often the cause-motion construction is about manipulating concrete objects. So this would be about not interpersonal relationships, but rather about embodied experience that is very general and very, well, an everyday kind of experience. And so I don't suppose that this kind of experience has changed a lot over the past couple of hundred years. So we still get out of bed in the morning, we get dressed, we take things out of containers and put them back in, and so on and so forth. And some of these events we express with the cause-motion construction, and certain animacy configurations appear over and over again, so that animate beings, well, they act on inanimate beings and change their shape, or cut them in half, or give them a new shape, or something like that. Yeah. So I don't think that, well, at least I wouldn't expect there to be significant changes that relate to social issues such as interpersonal authority in that sense.
Okay, so one question, I promise this is the last one, related to animacy too. Irene Shecker asks, what did you end up doing with those borderline animacies, such as collectives and body parts?
Yeah, collectives I included. So if it's something like the committee or the band or the family, those I coded as animate beings. And things like eyes and body parts, or things that would be associated with animate beings, like thoughts and feelings, those I coded as inanimate. So basically everything that could stand metonymically for an entire human being, I coded as animate, and everything that didn't, I did not. And so with regard to the eyes, well, the eyes are really just a part. They can stand metonymically for the entire person in other contexts, but not in these cases.
Okay, thank you very much, Martin. We could certainly go on with this fascinating subject, but unfortunately, time is up. Thank you all for being here. Hope to see you again at the next Abralinha ao Vivo.
Bye-bye. With pleasure, with pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.